I'm pleased to say that we've got two new members of the team, Lucy and Alfie, so welcome. What?
I just waved.
Just waved, yeah. Yeah, you can't see Alfie waving, unfortunately. Right, so I'd like to get us started with a quotation from Gavrilo Princip, who is a Bosnian Serb, who's the man who killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand to start World War I, of course. And this is, of course, very related to the topic of Yugoslavia. The quotation goes forth: "I'm a Yugoslav nationalist, aiming for the unification of all Yugoslavs, and I do not care what form of state, but it must be free from Austria." Now, on that note, I'd like to introduce the topic by asking everyone about the creation of the state of Yugoslavia and who the previous territories were ruled by, who are the people there, cultures and religions, etc., etc. Does anyone want to get started on this? Ibrahim?
So obviously, prior to World War I, you have the independent Serbia and also Croatians, Bosnians and Slovenians under the Austrian Empire. Now, there were already pretty big divides in the region. Serbia is Orthodox. They're the largest ethnic South Slavic group in the region. You have Croatians and Slovenians who are more economically, they have a better economic position, and they're also different religions. Catholicism and Orthodoxy, you have that, and Islam is also in the region in Bosnia, and you have different sort of views that they want to take the state. The Serbians want a more centralized, unitary state, while other Slavic groups want regionalism, federalism. So you can already start to see these divisions, and when you get to the formation of the country, this still persists.
Yes. Well, we see the creation of Yugoslavia kind of in theory at the Corfu Declaration of 1917, where, as Ibrahim pointed to, it was kind of viewed as more of a greater Serbia, because it was the kingdom of Serbia. They encompassed the Yugoslav kingdoms. By Yugoslav, it means southern Slav. It's an interesting kind of side note, but Yug means south in sort of Slavic languages. Anyway, I know it's not really incredibly useful, but it just goes to show how this is proposed to be a homeland for the southern Slavs. And also, adding to what Ibrahim said, the Ottomans ruled the areas that were traditionally more associated with the Muslim population, so like Albania, North Macedonia, those kinds of regions. And the Austro-Hungarians ruled areas like Serbia and Bosnia.
Well, the Ottomans had Bosnia.
The Ottomans did have Bosnia,
and
before.
Serbia went under Habsburg control, in and out of it multiple times throughout the centuries.
Well, I suppose that explains why the Bosniaks were Muslim as well. Anyway, so Tito himself, or Tito's a character we're going to get onto later, very important character. He described Yugoslavia as a country with 2 alphabets, 3 languages, 4 religions, and 5 nationalities, which sort of gives you quite succinctly a picture of the incredible diversity of the region. Does anyone want to talk about Tito and World War II and how it affected Yugoslavia? Anyone? Hashim? Oh, gosh, right. Go on, Lucian, go on. Maiden speech.
So, between the interwar years of early Yugoslavia, there wasn't too much going on. That changed massively during the Second World War, where under the Nazi Germany invasion of Yugoslavia, they faced quite a big test, which was basically going under rule, and they had it quite badly during the whole process of World War II. However, despite this, many were known to fight quite strong and quite fearless resistances during their time under occupation, whilst some might have been more sympathetic, particularly, I think, the Slavic state, many of the patriots and the nationalists were much keener to preserve their own identity. And this also played a huge impact to when the USSR eventually pushed back all the way back to Berlin in Germany, and they're effectively freed from this Nazi occupation. But the price of that is then they are put in the centre stage for the Cold War.
Yes, that's a very good point you make, Lucian. I just wanted to touch on something I forgot to mention, which is that essentially the creation of Yugoslavia was formalised after World War I with Woodrow Wilson's 14 points of self-determination for the Slavs in Europe. But yes, you're very right, Lucian, about World War II. The partisans were very successful at sort of challenging and in some cases defeating the Nazis. The Nazis had as we can expect from Nazis, I suppose, an incredibly brutal and repressive rule over the Yugoslavs. They had concentration camps allied with Croatian fascists that oversaw the killing of thousands of Serbs, Jews and Roma. Now, Tito was an incredibly important figure in this because he's the person that led the resistance against the Nazis via the partisans. They were very successful. They were often viewed as the most successful partisan group in Europe. But does anyone have any kind of background of Tito to speak of? Right, Ibrahim?
Well, Tito has sort of a unique position. He's not Serbian at all. He's Slovenian Croatian. So he has that sort of position where he's able to cultivate his partisan movement around Yugoslavia as a whole, which really allows him to be that most successful, as Kingsley mentioned. And he's able to sort of gain the trust and respect of everyone in the region, which even the King's movement couldn't do. So now he's loved, he's seen as sort of a brother or a family member, a neighbour of everyone in the region. He sort of takes on those kingly ideals while not being a king at all. And that allows him to ensure stability in Yugoslavia to a degree until his death, which obviously means there's problems after. But, 81% of Serbs today think life under him was better. He's named the best Croatian. So you can really see how he's a unifying figure for all South Slavs during the occupation.
Yeah, that's a very good point you make, Ibrahim. And I think that whilst generally in the United Kingdom we don't tend to extol the virtues of communist regimes, but I think that with regard to Tito's influence over the region, we could certainly view it as effective. I mean, his method of government with regard to the states is kind of similar to a Soviet or even an American kind of organisation. It was a federal system because Yugoslavia was Yugoslav FSR, Federal Socialist Republic, and it was the different countries that we now know, but Serbia was split into two regimes, which were Vojvodina and Kosovo. Yeah, Kosovo in the south, and essentially they were ruled by a federal government, which is the Yugoslav one. He was I think it was Lucian mentioned, quite an interesting figure with regard to the Cold War, since he's someone who is quite unprecedented in history for being able to stand up to Stalin and live to tell the tale. He refused to join the Warsaw Pact, I believe, and from that he was expelled from Cominform. And as a result, Yugoslavia was put in quite actually good economic position because it meant that America and the Soviets were vying for control of it or influence over it, which they supplemented through economic incentive. Does anyone else have anything to add about Tito's regime in Yugoslavia? Go on, Lucian.
Yeah, so obviously, as you've touched upon, there was a clear economic benefit as they chose basically to play both sides off each other whilst economically prospering. And Tito was seen as a very effective leader. He was very popular. He was seen as a strong leader who could stand up to some of the biggest, most powerful and most feared leaders in the world. One of the slight flaws of Tito, though, is that there wasn't an immediate heir to his regime. So this created a slight problem that a lot of people potentially didn't want to think about at the time, because whilst at the time they were prospering, there was always a looming threat of danger, both externally and internally.
Yes. Yeah, it's good that you mentioned that, Lucian, because it's what ends up happening is after Tito's death, what ends up happening is the presidency gets split into, I believe, 8 different parts corresponding to the different states within Yugoslavia. And that obviously means that the decisions are much more laboured and it's much more difficult to make them. But it also has the effect of splitting Yugoslav identity, which is something that Tito was vehemently against. I mean, part of his kind of mantra with regard to socialism, heavily influenced, but was the kind of suppression of religion, because he saw it primarily as a threat because it divided the Yugoslav people. As Ibrahim mentioned, you have different religions like the Serbs are Orthodox Christians, Croats Catholics, and Bosnians Muslim, for example. Ibrahim, you had something to add?
Yeah, I mean, although Tito didn't really want the split of Yugoslavia, obviously, he had, throughout his reign, facilitated a very, one-party state. The whole organisation was reliant on him. He didn't really set up what would really happen after him. And, although he had kept the state together, he had done, he'd gone through brutal suppression of freedom of speech, other parties. So even though he kept things under the cover, he didn't actually solve any of the underlying problems. And, when you have the massive geopolitical issues in 89, 1991, the state can't really survive through that. So although we see Tito as someone who keeps the state alive, he also doesn't facilitate its continued survival.
Yeah, it's a case of, with all dictators, that the state becomes dependent on the leader itself, so that when inevitably the leader isn't there, the state becomes extremely fragile, and I think Yugoslavia is a great case of that.
Yes, so now you've discussed Tito, I think it'd be appropriate to talk about the aftermath of Tito's death in 1980. At this point, as I've mentioned, the presidency was split up into 8, but I'd like to talk about the economic factors if anyone wants to give us a little rundown of those. Alfie?
John. So I think probably the main economic issue that faced Yugoslavia was the difference in economic strength between each of the areas. You see, there was, at one point, the gross national product of Slovenia was 7 times that of Kosovo, and I think that caused a great deal of conflict within Yugoslavia, because obviously these Slovenians, they don't feel that it's fair that resources should be shared equally between each area, and that they should invest in Kosovo when their economic and quite traditional way of thinking just wasn't getting the same return, and they just weren't as effectively economic as Slovenia, as Serbia, so they just thought it wasn't fair.
Yeah, that's a really good point you raised there, Alfie, actually, because the actual model of... Oh, Hashim, you had something to add? Okay. Oh, you can talk first anyway. The actual model of economics that they pursued in Yugoslavia, since it was kind of left... Now, at this point, it was kind of left-leaning, non-aligned movement country, not quite staunchly communist, but essentially what they had was they had varying degrees of capitalist competition, or what we interpret as capitalist anyway. You had worker unions running factories, but what essentially happened was these factories became controlled by worker boards, and you'd have to get onto these to make decisions, and you'd have to get onto these boards via a democratic process of voting. But what that essentially always meant was that the workers that would vote for you, the only way you'd win their votes is by promising higher wages. So, go on, Lucian, you have something to add?
Yeah, so just building off your point, one of the problems with that whole system, basically, of this kind of democratically run business, is whenever they promised higher wages, the inevitable thing they'd start doing is raising the prices because to pay for the wages, basically. And then this would instantly trigger, obviously, inflation, and it would then start the whole spiral again and again and again. And at first this could be coped with because they were getting economic aid from both the West and the USSA and the USSR. So both were kind of almost in a bidding war. However, at this time, towards the death of Tito, it was becoming more and more apparent that there was going to be an inevitability of the USSR's fall due to the clear economic dominance being provided by the USA. This in turn inevitably triggered the truth that there was no need now to pay Yugoslavia to remain a loyal or neutral state. And unfortunately this meant both withdrew their funding nearly at the exact same time. And because of this, now that you've got spiralling inflation and you've now just lost all your economic aid, the inevitability was going to be there was a financial disaster.
Yeah, very good, Lucian. Very, very well explained. Well, you can tell Lucian's an economics student there. You are, aren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, very good. Sorry, if I got that wrong, that would have been quite embarrassing. Anyway, yes, that's a good point you made, because what ended up happening was when the government started subsidising all these businesses who were losing profit, after the fall of the Soviet Union, they didn't have as much foreign investment because, of course, as I mentioned previously, the Americans and the Soviets were both vying for influence over Yugoslavia. But since the Soviets were gone, the Americans had, again, no incentive to invest there, and the Soviets couldn't invest because they, well, no longer existed. And so that meant that Yugoslavia could no longer actually afford to subsidise these collapsing businesses. And the government just couldn't really cope with the inflation that ended up happening, because not only did you have lots of inflation, you had lots of debt. And as a kind of, well, something that runs quite as a common theme within history, I would say, is that economic tensions lead to ethnic and racial tensions. And does anyone want to get onto the ethnic tensions within Yugoslavia at the fall of Tito and, well, post? Go on, Hashim.
Yeah, sure. So, Croat and Serbian interrelations had never really been that great. Croats, even after the Second World War, were even calling some Serbians Turkish Orientals. But I think with the economic collapse is that, of course, Serbians very much seeing that the Croats, the reason they bring the benefit to Yugoslavia was very much in that economic sense. And if the economy isn't wrong, what is the purpose now of the Croats? The Serbians very much see their role as defence, very much with their strong military. And so as a result, those ethnic tensions ultimately start being ideas of nationalism start to be concerned, and that this idea of it's better to be separate than together, really in the 80s to come together, especially in a time, America is starting to expand its ideas also in terms of national identity around the world. And the Soviet Union under Gorbachev are starting to expand the idea of more autonomy for the nations in the Soviet Union.
Lucian?
So basically I think the final straw for the idea of unity was when Yugoslavia went to the International Monetary Fund. Basically they wanted to get economically bailed out because they were on the verge of complete economic collapse. Now, one of the problems was they said, we'll only give you the money if you economically reform to a more profitable business model. Now, the problem was this would mean Yugoslavia as a whole would have to reform into a whole different economy. The problem was within these republics that were within Yugoslavia, many of them didn't really feel the need or want to reform. Croatia, for example, was doing very well and was on a par with states like Israel and Ireland, whilst more poorer areas were actually practically third world republics. So this triggered this huge economic inequality and divide that would be worsened ultimately by cultural and religious tensions. And this ultimately triggered the idea then, we don't want to be part of Yugoslavia anymore, we want to form our own states.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about the kind of economic potential idea that the other countries are holding them back, which Alfie expertly enlightened on. Now, Alfie, you had something to add, I believe?
Yeah, I was just going to backtrack a bit to Hashim talking about ethnic tensions. I think one of the main sort of exacerbations of the ethnic tensions was the fact that originally when borders were sort of drawn between each of the different states in Yugoslavia, at the beginning there were less different minority groups, but I think as the years went on, different groups would move about into different countries, which then meant that by sort of the late 1980s, 1990s, there were quite large minorities within different areas, which places like Serbia, I think there was a 10% of the Kosovan population was Serbian. So Serbia and Milosevic, who I assume we'll get onto later,
Yeah.
he was quite adamant that we should have these Serbian people in Serbia because they're Serbian. So I think that was one of the major issue which should have really been thought about beforehand.
Well, I'm glad you've mentioned Slobodan Milosevic's name, because he was elected in 1989 and was a radical nationalist, radical Serb nationalist, and he wanted this kind of greater Serbia. Now, after the breakup, like Alfie said, it was very messy. There were lots of different ethnic groups in different places as they moved around the former country. Now, as a result of this, when Croatia and Slovenia broke away, Serbia under Milosevic decided they were going to invade because 12% of the Croatian population was Serb, and his idea of protecting ethnic Serbs was very central to this. We can certainly draw a parallel between this and Putin's rationale for invading Ukraine and protecting ethnic Russians. Essentially, what they did was, they invaded Croatia, and it lasted. Oh, sorry, I can't actually remember. So Croatia lost around a quarter of its territory here. They tried to invade Slovenia as well, but that only lasted 10 days before the EU precursor resolved it. The EC, yes, that's good actually. Yeah, the European Community. Bosnia also tried to succeed, and they had a large Serbian population, so Serbia also invaded. And this is something that is really crucial to get onto, because I want to introduce now the idea of the human rights abuses really that happened within Bosnia during the civil war, with groups such as Serbian nationalist groups led by people like Radovan Karadzic. Does anyone want to talk about those? Go on, Hashim.
So I think only one key example. General Vladic in Bosnia is a famous example of when the Serbians did invade. Of course, quite a lot of Muslim men had been captured in families, and of course we talked about the religious disagreements, different Orthodox and Catholic. The idea of Muslims, the idea of a very Christianized form of nationalism was completely intolerable. And so famously, and American news rooms also reported this, is that he famously gave quite a lot of sweet. Children came up to him when he was surveying the troops, and they asked for food and such due to lack of resources. And he told the soldiers to give them sweets and such. But after the cameras were turned off, quite a lot of the fathers and quite a lot of the men or military-aged men were taken, lined up, and then shot at and killed. And of course, one of the most famous incidents, of course, being Srebrenica.
Ibrahim?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the death toll for this war, it's 140,000. The brutality of this is insane. A lot of the Serbian population today wouldn't even deny it, the official government position. When you look at it, you've got 64,000 Bosniaks, 24,000 Serbs, 8,000 Croats. There's a ton of deaths here, and when you look at the international side of it, this does turn opinion against Yugoslavia, of course, and countries like Germany are quick to recognise Croatia and Slovenia. But it seems that the ideas about what a union should be and who should lead it has always been the main issue dividing them. And that is exacerbated by their political, economic and social differences. And you can see, just how much this caused issues when the Yugoslav war started.
Hashim, you had something to add?
Yeah, I think also just the idea for the Yugoslavians, there's just no great story uniting them apart from a possible linguistic, as being part of the Slavic language family. There's not actually that much that unites these people together, whether it be other religious forms or as we said with ethnicities. Is that for any nation really to exist, there has to be some myth that we all believe in that society, and there's just no myth that ultimately there's myths for the Serbians, there's myths for the Croats. There's no myth that unites this entire the entire of the Balkan territory.
Alfie?
I think there is quite the Slavic people. They are quite proud to be Slavic. I think I wouldn't want to undermine the importance of it, and the idea of, you see Russia, they are identify as Slavic, and to the extent of
the Ukrainians.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I suppose Alfie, correct me if I'm wrong, but are you trying to get out here kind of equivalence to the Soviet Union in that people were proud to be Soviets, not only just proud to be Russian or Ukrainian. They had this collective identity, even if it was separated by an ethnic or a religious grouping.
Yeah, and I'm just saying that within the Yugoslavia, it's literally called Yugoslavia. There is definitely
there isn't similarity.
There is.
It isn't strong enough.
Yeah, I'd say that it would still take quite a lot to break it down, though.
Lucian?
I think what made the war to follow so deadly was that it wasn't as simple as seceding land. An example would be, for example, Kosovo. where basically the Serbs went under a revolt, because despite it being such a large part of Serbia throughout the Middle Ages, it was now majority Albanian, so it was a very difficult decision to go who gets what, basically. And this triggered a lot of strong words and potentially war crimes, like ethnic cleansing was starting to be used, possibly even as far as genocide was happening in Kosovo, which made it so brutal and so deadly and started this whole wave of displaced peoples in certain areas. And I think one of the problems was why these secessions of land basically for independence came so quickly, was they were hoping it would be more like Czechoslovakia, which had a few years earlier a very peaceful breaking apart of their nation. Unfortunately, this went horribly wrong due to the fact that it was so complex, the diversity within these areas.
Yes, that's very good, gentlemen. I just wanted to get on to the kind of end of the war and just how it came about, how the split was formalised. So, Hashim, did you want to say something about that?
Just about American involvement in the split. So, okay. So, famously, Clinton had been quite ambivalent around American position in Yugoslavia. So, many after the invasion, the Serbian invasion, imposed sanctions on Serbia, but no one really went much further than that. However, of course, with as of course known also with Slavic refugees, they weren't considered as economically as beneficial as many would have seen. Also, of course, with Italy wanting to keep its own stability around the area, and of course, with the 90s, of course, being that era with the collapse of communism, many people were seeing this decade as time to move on from being Americans specifically, being so overly involved with the rest of the world. However, with this, of course, Clinton does change his position, and ultimately with the UK also starting to be more interested with trying to regain some form of stability in the area. NATO then ultimately gets involved with setting up civilian safe zones, and ultimately one of America's biggest strengths using the Air Force as a result in order to stop the war, and including, of course, bombing, which actually in this case was backed by Russia of Serbian positions. Of course, Bosnia that declared independence, while Kosovo and Montenegro still were part of the Greater Serbia, and of course Montenegro would only split in 2006 through referenda.
Yes, so just to add the kind of flourish on the end, these leaders such as Slobodan Milosevic and Radovan Karadzic were found guilty in The Hague of crimes like Lucian has elucidated, genocide, ethnic cleansing, etc., etc. But something that I found quite interesting when researching this is when the intelligence services caught Radovan Karadzic, who was the leader of this kind of Serb militant groups in Bosnia, committing these horrific atrocities like in Srebrenica, killing entire villages, etc., etc. He was disguised as a yoga teacher, and he had a man bun, which I found quite interesting. One of the most arguably evil men in history, looking so innocent. Anyway, thank you very much for listening to this week's, sobering, 29 minutes in the past, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to this. And next week, Mr. Bark hasn't told us about what's going on next week, so we're going to have to lobby him after this, I think. But thank you very much for listening, and we hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you in a fortnight's time. Thank you very much.